Thanks to all you who are here. I'm Ian Gray. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Centre Alexandre Koyré at the Ecole des Hautes Etudes en Sciences Sociales in Paris. And I'm one of the co-organizers of the Environment and Climate Change Network at SASE, that's Network S, and we'll be moderating today's session. And we're really excited to kick off the conference with this virtual session looking at various institutional and political economic aspects of climate action in energy markets and labor movements across a range of high income and middle income economies. Today's panelists, they bring us a rich set of cases analyzing contradictions between climate goals in China and the state's ongoing investments in foreign fossil fuel infrastructure, a study on the development of Japanese hydrogen markets, a comparative analysis of how different union employment structures influence union support for climate policies in Germany and the UK, and a market as politics explanation for the surprising increase in private equity purchases of coal and nuclear plants in the US.
So thanks everybody for coming, and Ian for, I guess, moderating the panel, and for the others, the other organizers of Network S. It's really great of you to put so much time into this. It's very valuable to me as a researcher who's trying to change my research focus towards climate issues. There we go. So let me just give you a little background to this project. It's a newish project. I presented for the first time last year in Amsterdam at SASE. And so if you were at that audience, thanks again for coming again. And let me just walk everybody through so that I can orient you towards the question I'm asking. So this project has origins. I'm from Ohio, in the Midwest of the United States, and what got my attention was how corrupt our energy policy was. So it's a real, first I was just a bystander reading the newspapers, but now it's part of my research. And I was very influenced by Lee Stokes' book, 2020 book, where she uses Ohio, my state, as one of her cases. My reaction was, it's an amazing book and she gets it all right, but her focus was only on why we went backwards with our policy towards renewables and energy efficiency, whereas part of another big chunk of the story that she doesn't really address directly is this question of who's buying up the nuclear power plants and the coal power plants, and why are they getting subsidies? So that's really been the focus. And what I've discovered in my research is you can't really answer that question unless you understand this massive US, what we in the United States tend to call the deregulation of the electricity system, going back to the 90s or really the 70s. And in particular, the creation of wholesale electricity markets. And I'm just going to see if I can dash ahead just to show you. There's these different colors of the wholesale electricity markets, and so there's 7 of them in the United States and then 2 in Canada. And so I'll get back to those in a second. I just thought I would flag and let you see them. And so, of course, the overall purpose of my project is that this is really important to understand these wholesale markets and the incentives they're creating for the larger project of decarbonizing the grid. And here's just a little bit more background to get you to my question. So the blue, this is my state, Ohio, how much, where our electricity comes from. The blue is coal. So you can see natural gas is the big story in Ohio. And this is where my project starts, because the electric utilities, the incumbent electric utilities, which are publicly traded companies, owned all of these coal and nuclear power plants that were no longer competitive because the price of natural gas starting in about 2008 collapsed because of the new technology, fracking. I think this is a story that many people who follow this stuff are familiar with. So what happened? What did the utilities, these extremely powerful economic, energy, and political animals, what did they do? Well, it was sort of what did they do with these, what people call stranded assets? They're no longer able to produce competitive electricity. So it was a US style scramble to solve their problems. This was my early study. I did these on the left, or these, I looked at particular coal plants and nuclear power plants and what the utilities did with them. And what I found, and this is where my question comes from, is that, so there are some things that are, lots of interesting stuff here. One is the green that I circled in green. There's continuity, that some of the owners of coal plants succeeded in getting subsidies. Those coal plants still exist and will go on for a long time. But the red shows, is to indicate that there's these new actors in town, not so new, I guess, private investment funds. These are hedge funds and private equity firms, which is why I'm lumping them together and calling them private investment funds. They tend not to be publicly traded. And so my question is, why do they see profits in coal plants and nuclear plants when utilities don't? So just a little bit more about the question. I'm really excited about where this question is taking me, because it overlaps with, I mean, this is, where do prices come from? It's one of the biggest questions out there, from Hayek to, if you're in the world of energy and climate, Jessica Green is really into the prices of assets. So I really I can now engage in this literature. And I wanted to point out that before the Investment Reduction Act, which was passed last year in the United States, which is, obviously huge, there was really very limited US public policy governing the fate of these assets. And but these assets are obviously super consequential. What happens to coal plants and nuclear power plants is really important, not just for climate, but environmental justice issues and jobs. So this is really important. It's theoretically interesting. And one other thing that came out of this initial work was that, it's broader than coal and nuclear. These firms are everywhere. And I mean, they do raise all kinds of questions. They raise questions about, well, if you know something about private equity funds, there's a whole literature out there when they take over hospitals, when they take over municipal services, and usually it's not a very happy story. And so it does, for me, this is real, because private equity funds bought the nuclear power plant near my house, the nearest coal plants. And so, I mean, these are really serious questions, and I'll get back a little bit to what this means and how concerned we should be that these financiers are buying up these really important assets. Now, so part of the answer to my question, why these companies, why these financiers would buy up these assets, part of the answer lies in the big structures of financialized capitalism. And in particular, thinking of these companies as the nodes of a financialized capitalist system, or a financializing capitalist system, however you want to think about it, yeah, there's a lot of truth there. And so part of the answer comes from looking at what they do and who they are. For example, it is true that unlike utilities, which tend to be publicly traded, these private funds can do things that utilities can't do. And there's just less public scrutiny. They're not accountable to public investors in the same way. But there's actually, we can talk about that if you're interested, but I think that can be exaggerated. Second, that there's real talent and acumen in these firms that are just not present in utilities. So they just know how to use capital markets in ways that utilities don't. They have the expertise in-house. They buy up coal plants or nuclear plants, and instantly they refinance, they get a windfall profit. It's kind of impressive the way they work it. And of course, then there's also this expertise that utilities don't seem to have with energy and energy business models in general. Like I've learned from interviews that there's benefits in owning both gas and coal. However, in the main, I would say that these types of arguments aren't going to get us to to a comprehensive answer that I'm looking for answering this question. Instead, I think the main answers lie in the political configuration of these wholesale electricity markets that I mentioned. And in particular, it's the specific rules that are being decided through these big political battles. And that is what is attracting private equity funds, because it creates attractive prices of the assets, of electricity, and also of interconnections, which is part of what the coal plants have, these interconnections to the grid. So I'll get to this, I'll return to those in a second. So this is a markets as politics approach. It's my own blend here. I'm not new to this approach. I was very influenced early on by Fligstein's 2002 book. There's a little bit of Zeisman in me in thinking about this. But when I apply it to wholesale electricity markets, what I'm talking about are markets are comprised of specific rules, and they create winners and losers. They're manifestations. These rules are manifestations of political battles, settled and unsettled. And I think, or my hypothesis is that they explain much of the reason why private investment funds are doing what they're doing. So here again, these are these wholesale electricity markets. The one that's most I've learned most about is the PJM, because that's where Ohio is. That's where my cases were. It's one of 7. They call them RTOs or ISOs. Don't ask me why. It's a very long story. These are the authorities that structure and operate the wholesale electricity markets. They're under the authority of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That's U.S. federal level. Yet each of them has their own governance, governance, which it's really important that they vary. The PJM happens to have a stakeholder model. It's really different in California. Now, they develop gradually and idiosyncratically, and it's still very much an evolving system. And again, this is part of a decades-long restructuring of electricity system. So here, I just wanted to point out from what I learned from the Ohio cases, how crazily political these seemingly obscure, seemingly technocratic rules can be. So I looked at those 3 cases that I had shown you before, and here, in all of them, they're somehow tied to this wholesale electricity market. And in the rules that really stood out in my research. So there's one here about, it's called the MOPR, and it's answering the question, should generators, that's electricity generators receiving state level subsidies, like lots of state, as in New York and Ohio, when they get subsidies for renewables, can they participate in the market? Now that decision has gone back and forth between the Trump administration, the Biden administration, senators. It's been in the courts. The second one, it's capacity market demand curve. So there's this capacity market. It's to ensure that there's electricity when at emergency times. So coal plants buy contracts where they promise to provide that electricity. It turns out that the demand curve needs to be completely created from scratch. It couldn't be more political. Again, the demand response aggregators, it has to be decided, can they participate in the wholesale electricity market? And it turns out that there was a Supreme Court case that had to decide whether or not they could. And the answer was they could. And lastly, what I've most recently learned about, and this is really the big story now of what's attracting financiers into this market, is interconnections. It turns out, many of you are familiar that one of the big problems in the United States in transforming the energy system is the grid. And at least in the PJM, right now, you can't create a new connection into the grid. So if you wanted to do a renewables project, solar or wind, you would have to find an existing interconnection and buy it. And that's one of the main reasons that financiers are buying up the coal plants now. So and again, highly contested.
Yes.
I
have to intervene as the moderator and let you know that you're about at 14 minutes, and so
oh my goodness,
it's just fascinating. But I mean, you can take a minute maybe if you can.
I had two more slides, and so this is from this. I have a hypothesis for the project that I'd hoped to have ready for today. I've got this data. I got my library to buy it. It's expensive. Because it's industry data, and basically it's PitchBook data. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. It follows all the deals done by these financiers. And so my hypothesis is, since the rules are so different across these wholesale energy markets, is I'm going to go see, if I'm right, then what you see in the PJM, there's going to be a lot more activity, a lot more buying of coal and nuclear in one of these versus another. So that's where I'm going. Thanks. I'm sorry for going over. And I'm happy, if we have time for discussion, to talk about big picture stuff.
Okay, so thank you very much for having us. We wanted to talk about union strategies regarding climate change in Germany and the UK. How is the sound? Looking at faces, it doesn't look good.
No, I think you're okay. I think it's from my end, it's doable. I think it sounds great. I think you should pretend like it's perfect and go ahead and proceed.
So I won't talk much about the literature here. As you can see, we have looked into studies around what do we know about trade unions at the moment regarding climate change agendas, and there is an emerging and growing literature that looks into approaches. There is literature that has done case studies where we can see that actually the context in which trade unions operate is really important. So we are looking here at two countries, UK and Germany, which are in different contexts, coordinated and liberal market economies. And there you can already see what we know from previous studies, where we see that in the area of restructuring, reorganization, vocational education and training, we see the differences when it comes to shaping the climate agendas. What we have done here is we reviewed all the union policies and the green initiatives that trade unions themselves as organizations have developed in looking at the Congress motions and looking at Congress motions, policy papers, and doing interviews with national union officers. So here you see the kind of unions that we have spoken to, and this research is still ongoing. So we do carry out interviews at the moment. Just for most of you that will be probably familiar, to give a kind of rememberings, where do we see the main difference regarding the employment relations systems? We have a high level of social partnership institutions. We have a rather, in Germany, a high skill road to the apprenticeship system. And in the UK, we have a voluntarist employment relations system with a quite market-driven logic and a rather low-skilled system when it comes to the vocational education. The bargaining in Germany happens at industry level, is mostly at sectoral level, while in the UK it's more at an employer level. We have workplace reps and no worker representation on the company boards, while in Germany we have a dualistic worker representation, and we have a strong institution of works councils who have a lot of negotiating power at the companies themselves. So this is a kind of background, and then here you see that we have gone through the motions and we have classified them according what we have found in the literature, where there was the first kind of attempt to classify what type of policy orientations do we find among unions when it comes to climate change. So we identify here some that argue for a kind of eco-modernization with a weak market, some interference by the state, and redistribution. Then we find a strong market approach where basically everything is left to the market. And then a more radical or more socialist approach where you can see we had ideas that in the UK, for example, that the ownership of energy production should go back into state hands. And what we have done now is twofold. So first of all, we have looked how did this develop over time. And here you can see that in the UK, for example, a lot of the radical approaches have been linked to Jeremy Corbyn's political reign. So there was a kind of empowerment of more radical ideas among trade unions in a close relationship with the Labour Party. And we were now interested in how do these policies that come up at Congress, how do workers actually think about this? To understand, so are the unions as organizations radical enough for what the workforce and the members actually think? And how does this come up in terms of the policies? So here you can see that the market approaches, the UK workers are much more in favor of this. So there seems to be a kind of more overlap between the kind of general economic system and what workers do think about it. If you look here, the German workers are more in favor of the kind of redistributive policies around climate change. Yeah, so the public subsidies for the extension and building of renewable energies, the investments into public transport systems. So something that we would probably expect from a more coordinated social market economy. It's interesting then here when we look at the more radical policy approaches, where you had seen there were much more from trade unions in the UK, and actually the kind of support this has among workers is almost pretty even. There is not much difference, although in both countries it has quite a huge number of supporters. So almost like kind of 50% are in favor of those radicalist solutions. And I come back to interpreting this in a minute. I just wanted to add another layer, that we also looked at what happens actually within the trade unions as organizations themselves. So what happens in terms of, besides this rhetorics of motions, what do they actually try to implement as practice as unions? And here you can see in terms of the agenda setting that there is a lot of dialogue going on, direct lobbying, but a lot of consultation in tripartite committees in Germany, while it's much more one-dimensional in the UK. There's basically only just one institution that has been newly created for climate change, while in the German case, it's more that the existing tripartite institutions have been used to put climate onto the agenda of the existing kind of ongoing dialogue anyway. Here you see an interesting case as well in Germany, where short working schemes are very popular in terms of response to crisis. We did have this yes. Okay. And there are some people going. Oh, I know. Apologies. So the quiet space here is not easy to protect. So there has been the institution of short working hours as a response to the financial crisis, in response to the COVID crisis, and this has been now reinvented for the climate crisis. So basically, that workers who are okay with reskilling for a green job can get a kind of short-term working allowance where they have like 2 years funded by government on the same terms of their job conditions to do this retraining. So these are all examples that in Germany a lot happens within the kind of existing institutions, and climate becomes an additional topic. While on the UK, you see here extra institutions that are built. Yeah, so there's an extra green job task force. There is an extra newly created regional hub in Yorkshire and Humber, where we are based, where there has been a climate commission established. So here you see the same in picture if it comes to the sectoral negotiation, bargaining and agreements. This happens within the existing traditions, and in the UK then, because there is low level of sectoral dialogue, then there is no dialogue over the kind of transition of the workplaces. Maybe to try to bring this all together, so that you, on the one hand, you see there is happening in the German case a lot in the existing institutions. The unions as actors are quite conservative in terms of their policy suggestions, and you could probably argue that the membership might be a little bit more progressive and that the unions are lacking a little bit behind, while in the UK, everything that is happening within the climate agenda is pretty much new. There is much less of a kind of past dependency or use of existing institutions. And they come up as organizations, they come up with very radical ideas, which are not necessarily supported by workers. And it's not really implemented because they lack the institutions to implement it. So if we bring this back to the initial question, to what extent is union action shaped around climate change, shaped by the existing institutions, then we could argue that they are very much bound and restricted by the existing institutions that there are, and that there's maybe some scope for more progressive policies, but it seems to rely on a more rhetorical level and not on a really policy level. So really apologies for this bad noise conditions. I stopped sharing. I was so looking forward to see everybody. Hope to see you soon again in person then.